And we're live. Hi everyone, with me today is Baron de Ropp from Dungeon Masterpiece. Thank you again for being with us today. I know you have a very busy schedule. So, just going to say hi to everyone in the chat. Hi Charlene. And
I should pull up the chat.
yeah, I think we'll have a few less people today than usual because it's not our normal hours, but
Right.
yeah, you know, this will still be up after that.
Okay.
So, Baron, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself and about your channel?
Yeah, I run the channel Dungeon Masterpiece. My name is Baron de Ropp. I kind of focus on DMing advice. It's more of a talking head. I also do a little bit of, hot take social commentary about gaming culture. And I think probably the most niche thing that I focus on that nobody else does is fantasy world building through the lens of geopolitics. So understanding how geography plays roles in state dynamics and how various cultures and nation states interact with the geography, and through the context of that geography, how they interact with each other.
Yeah, that was one of the main series that really made me want to ask you to come over on a stream, because I had never really thought about that in the context of how
Right.
that affects world building, and it is really incredibly important because historically I think that that's one of the major drivers behind most things.
Right. No, I think, looking at it from, I have a few people call it like human geography, which I guess is more of a socially focused
Mhm.
part of that. Or how would I describe the difference between the two? But if human geography discusses how humans interact with the geography in particular, geopolitics is more focused on the political structures and how states ensure their own security or project authority through the lens of how they do that. And when geopolitics first was conceived as an idea, um, it was back in the late 1800s, early or very early 1900s. I can't remember exactly when, but it was a geographer by the name of Halford Mackinder who created this very like romantic idea about he created what was called the heartland theory, which basically means that whoever controls Eastern Europe controls the world. It was a very romantic, grand strategy kind of understanding of the world, but and that was a very elementary first step. And as we've progressed through time over the past 100 years, our understanding of what actually makes geopolitics tick, how power structures are related to the geography, or how, not, I shouldn't say power structures, but how state actors that operate on their geography
Okay, when you say
interact with each other.
when you say state actor, what does that mean exactly?
So that could very well mean a nation state. That's definitely the most common way that we could understand it. But as some geopoliticians, especially like French school geopolitics, they started to really dive into like getting away from a grand strategy concept of like a global understanding of the world, and how you can apply geopolitics to a very local setting. So you could say that a homeowners association, or a like a neighborhood community is a state actor, for example, because they have some kind of control over a a population and the geography that it exists in. Like if you live in a subdivision, if you live in a neighborhood, then your neighborhood association has some kind of control, and the geography that it exists in creates this underpin structure of how it can operate with other nearby neighborhoods, with the local government, etc.
Okay, so basically we're saying that given a set of conditions or resources, then that's going to base how do you say it? Not the power structure, but it's going to affect the choices that the owners of that area will make. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So for example, if you were to look at it from a very macroscopic nation state view, geopolitics kind of defines that a nation needs, or a body of people needs two things to be secure. They need food.
Hmm?
They need a number of things to be secure. They need food, but that means that they need arable land in which to do agriculture on, right? Then they need navigable rivers in which they can use in order to quickly move that the food or whatever resources they harvest out of the ground. They need navigable rivers in order to rapidly trade those materials up and down the river system, because using a river or using boats on the river is by far the cheapest way, the most easy, most affordable way in order to move those materials. You can do it on horse and buggy, you can do it with trucks, you can do it with cars, you can do it on rail, but using a barge is way cheaper. So you need navigable rivers in order to connect all of those agrable land areas together. And then ideally, you also need some sort of geographic landform, be it mountains or some large body of water, like a massive lake or an ocean, in order to secure your borders so that nobody can come and try to take what you've got, right?
Okay.
So, and if you have all those things, then likely, it's very, very likely that you're pretty much doomed to just be a geopolitical success. Like, it doesn't matter what your internal politics or internal ideologies are, it's just going to work out for you. And there's a few places on the globe where you can see that geography create a very, very stable, almost never changing geopolitical structure, where states just tend to be far more secure than not because of those geographies. So, for example, the United States of America,
Okay.
France is another one. Argentina is another great example. Argentina is really a poster child because it has a massive navigable river that runs right through the second largest flat agrable plain in temperate areas. So it's got all of the right environment, climate wise, to grow all kinds of food, and it's surrounded by ocean and mountains on all sides. So it's going to be really hard for somebody to invade it.
Yeah, but thinking about it, I mean, if you take Rome, for example, at various points they didn't have enough land to supply themselves with food for their citizens, and they didn't have any hard border, like you mentioned, so they had to you know, substitute their military for that. Is that correct?
Which group was this? Who did you say?
Ancient Rome. We're talking.
Oh yeah. So yeah, ancient Rome is a really good example because it was constantly in turmoil, over the time span that it existed, and that's largely because Rome, once its population started to grow, was very food insecure, and it required so much agricultural reliance on Egypt in order to keep the population from starving. So, and I want to say I'm not fully versed in Roman history. You'll have to forgive me. I'm reaching to the grasps of my edges there, but I want to say that's also why they were invading Gaul, is because it wasn't just subduing the barbarians, as they put it. It was also they needed to project past the Alps so that they could get even more agrable land, and we're just hoping that they could find stuff up there. So you get into Bavaria, and that whole region on the other side of the Alps is a very flat area, but of course moving food from moving food across the Alps would have been extremely expensive. So it may have been more of a security issue, but anytime that there was like famine or an agricultural problem in Egypt, it always kicked off social unrest in Rome. That is absolutely a fact.
Okay, so am I oversimplifying it if I say that the absence of any of those factors that you mentioned, like a solid border, food supply, and means of transport, as soon as you're missing those, then you're going to have tensions in the state structure?
So yes and no, not necessarily. So how would I answer that? If you have one of those things and then suddenly one of those things is disrupted, that's absolutely when you're going to have a problem.
Right.
Probably the best demonstration of that in very recent current events, recent history, is taking a look at agricultural exports from Russia in 2014.
Okay.
They had a really bad weather pattern in southern Russia that killed a bunch of crops there. I think was it a freeze or was it I can't remember if it was a freeze or a drought. They had one of the two, and it killed a ton of wheat crop in southern Russia. And that happened in 2014, leading to inflated food prices all across the Middle East, because Russia sells a lot of food to Middle Eastern populations. And when food prices go up, the people who are most squeezed by that are the working class in those countries. And it kicked off the Arab Spring. That was one of the largest contributors to the Arab Spring. Is people were disgruntled but content with the bad power structure, the bad people that were in power at the time. There are lots of dictators, but then once they weren't getting enough food, it's like, okay, it's not worth dealing with a despot anymore. Let's get rid of them. So
Okay.
that's what kicked off the Arab Spring. So and then to look at you were talking about shutting down transport.
Mhm.
That can be a little harder to do, but one of the biggest tactics during the American Civil War of the North, or I should say, one of the most key strategies, was to quickly move a blockade down to the city of New Orleans, because that's the that's the outlet point of the Mississippi River, which is the largest river system on the planet. So if you can shut down the ability of the Confederate States in order to get supplies from overseas through the Mississippi River, you basically control all of their trade.
Oh,
So
okay.
and that was the one of the very first things that the Union did against the Confederate States, was to shut down their trade and just slowly bleed out their supplies, because they weren't able to safely bring in supplies inland without getting it, bringing it through South Carolina or Florida, which was much more expensive to do, as they were getting supplies from Great Britain. So
I see. So basically, in that case, it's a situation of slowing down everything, guys. Just like anytime you would attack a baggage train or a supply train, but this is practically on a continental level.
oh yeah, absolutely. So and like the French geopolitician school described, like, you can zoom in and look at it on a supply chain level at basically ever since uh military activity started being done in months outside of summer.
Hmm.
That was basically, you had campaign season and you had harvest season and winter.
Yeah, true.
But like, once you get past that era, I guess around 1650, 1700, everything was all about supply chain management. And that's one of the things that made Napoleon so dangerous, was he figured out the logistics of being able to distribute his supply chains across many of his army corps, so that nobody could ever figure out where his supply chains were. And just by cutting one of them didn't really do
Yeah.
anything. Every army was able to operate completely independent of one another.
Okay, circling back to fantasy geopolitics.
Sure.
Uh, in general, do you find that let me rephrase it. Did you start looking into that just to see if the narratives of that particular game, that particular setting, makes sense with respect to the geography, or did you start looking into it to see how to, I don't know, create more believable settings or more coherent settings?
So yes and no. I think for the past probably 15 years of my dungeon mastering experience, I've always felt like there was just, every time I read a fantasy setting in general, I always felt like there was just something off about a lot of these different settings. And I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And it was kind of by happen chance, really, that I started becoming interested in geopolitics maybe half a decade ago or so, 4 years or so. But I'm now researching it and getting a certification for it, to do it professionally in my career. But I always felt like there was just something off. And when I've bumped into geopolitics as a concept, it really started to tie together, geography and history, and created this, substructure of understanding of like, why is it that wars, why does history always repeat itself, if that makes sense? Like there's something going on there that we are not understanding. It's like, why is there always conflict in very specific places on the map and not in other places? What's going on here? And once I started studying geopolitics and understanding why those things are the way they are, what causes that, that's when it kind of like blew the door off the hinges for me as far as fantasy world building. It's like, now I understand why I've had all these problems. I'm going to start sharing this with everybody.
And thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because thinking about it, if you take the standard fantasy plot of bad guy wants to take over the world.
Right.
Yeah, but why?
But why?
It's just because he's evil. Yeah. But if you put it in the context of what you're saying.
Yeah, and that's what really is interesting about it, because like, whatever your political ideologies are, internally, you can say whether or not you have a benevolent dictator or a tyrannical republic, but but once you get up to like the state actor level, it's all anarchy. It's all completely anarchy. You're the good guy, everybody else is evil. So unless you have extremely strong trade relationships with the people that you are your next door neighbors, where going into some kind of a hot war is just going to cause you to lose too much monetarily or cause instability internally because economies of scale can't operate. That's everybody is the bad guy. You're not the bad guy, everybody else is. So you really have like, there's really only one fundamental thing. It's, I want to get power so that I can control things, and now that I'm in power, everybody else wants to take it from me. So it's like this, it's a really self-damning situation you find yourself in, really.
Yeah, I can see that. It's again going back to the Roman history example.
Right.
Once you enlarge your border, the only thing you can do to protect yourself is to enlarge the border even more to subdue whatever's on the edges.
Exactly. And so just kind of add on to that, the Inca Empire is a really interesting example geopolitically, because their culture caused the next in line ruler, like they had a hereditary ruling caste system, but when a king died, because of the way their belief structure set about their monetary practices, they had to be like, their spirit didn't die, and because their spirit was still alive, they still needed all of their material assets. So like their body would be mummified, and they would be put on a pedestal with all of their gold and all of their bronze and all of their artifacts, and okay, fine, but now you're the next in line king, now you have no money. So you have to go.
Okay.
Now you have no money. So you had to expand your empire in order to conquer more people, in order to get more money, right? You had to press other nationalities all up along the South American coast there in order to push people into your empire and make them give you money. And whoever their ruling classes were, and much like the Roman Empire did, whoever their ruling classes was of the conquered people, you took all of their children and you educate them in your capital city, and then sent them back home so that they would all be properly Incan.
That's really weird, because
Yeah.
suddenly I just realized that putting a dead guy in a longboat with his riches and his stuff and then setting it on fire is probably more financially responsible than that.
Exactly. That interesting point of that is, you had in the Incan Empire, you had all of these kings that were paraded around with all of their earthly belongings. The mummies were just propped up on like platforms that were carried around for everybody to still praise and worship, even though they were dead. But their treasure hoards were carried around with them. And when the Spanish finally seized all that, that's basically what funded their ability to build Cusco and Lima, the two Spanish colony cities. So, real interesting.
Yeah, I mean, again, even the concepts of inheritance and the transfer of money and economy is definitely another interesting subject, and that definitely could be another several hours of discussion on its own.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So, Cross from Campaign Terrain is saying lots of RPGs have mining and farms, but they rarely make a mention of transporting goods.
Yes. I think Age of Empires 3 was the first RPG that I saw that actually did anything like that, where like you had, cards that you would get that would, come from your homeland and bring your supplies here to the battlefield, and you had to adjudicate like when and how much and how often you were going to use your resources, if I'm remembering that correctly. But yeah, it's really interesting how supply chain management is absolutely the most important aspect of modern warfare and is completely ignored by video games.
Earlier you mentioned history with regards to history repeating itself.
Say that again?
Sorry, earlier you mentioned that history has a tendency to repeat itself and that we see particular patterns occurring in the same regions and so on.
Right. So just as I was saying earlier that, a nation needs a handful of things. They need, a basin, an agricultural basin filled with rivers in order to do agriculture and trade on, and then either mountains or oceans or an extremely large desert in order to protect themselves from invasion on the outsides of their territory. Just as those things create stability, the lack of those things create instability. And I really think that this is what like the very first world geographer to coin the term geopolitics, Halford Mackinder, when he wrote his Heartland thesis, he recognized that there was always conflict historically in Eastern Europe. Here we are right now, and exactly where Mackinder said, whoever controls like the region that is now Ukraine, whoever controls that region controls the world, right? And that was his thesis that he postulated. But he recognized that all throughout history, invasion after invasion after invasion had gone through that territory as if people were trying to control it, right? Even Catherine the Great said when she had assumed control of the Tsar throne, she said the only way that Russia can be secure is to expand its borders. And it wasn't until the rise of the Soviet Union immediately after World War II that that polity had gained the borders that Catherine the Great said that she needed in order to remain secure. So there's something to be said there about like that observation. So if you go and look at the geography of that region, you'll see that it's got lots of river systems, but none of them are truly navigable. They all flow north. They all flow into like northern Russia, where they completely freeze up and dam up in ice dams. And because of that, like the weather patterns are super bizarre up there and cause just like cold blasting winds during the winter time. The summer gets really hot. The weather is super variable. It's a terrible place to live as far as like, thinking about like France or Argentina or central northern United States, as far as agricultural security goes. Terrible place to live. Like you can never predict the weather patterns. So and not only that, there are very few mountainous regions, and like the Ural Mountains kind of are there, but they're so far away from the southern region that you can just walk in with an army and nobody can stop you. So Napoleon did it, the Huns did it, the Mongols did it. the Novgorodians did it, the Swedes, the Lithuanians. Like, that region has been conquered so many times because it is so geographically insecure. And the only way you can make it secure is if you also control all of the regions around it, which is why Catherine the Great said, if we want to have a secure Russia, we must expand our borders. So, you know, it it becomes a history that repeats itself, because you can see geographical phenomenon like that happening across time over and over again. Anytime you have like large adjacent river systems, or really, that's the big one. It's large adjacent river systems that don't have some sort of geographical barrier between them. You're going to have separate state acting groups that try to control each river system, and then come into conflict or come into rivalry with each other, especially when those systems don't have some sort of if it can help if like one river system has materials, like one is really good for clay and then the other one is adjacent to a mountain region that has a lot of iron. You can trade the clay and iron, or their value added products. Like, I can make farming tools and you can make pottery, and we can trade those. And then going to war would cause us to lose both of those things, so that's not good, right? But so if you look at Eastern Europe, the Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, Southern Russia, tons of conflict has always happened there across human history. Similarly, you can look across the Chinese plain, where probably just because of cultural homogenization over the years, and it's probably because northern China is more temperate than southern China, the Han population in China has become the de facto cultural stabling factor. But Chinese politics is basically due for an upheaval, and due for one every 20 or every 200 years or so. Like, you don't see a Chinese kingdom controlling that entire area, that entire region along the Chinese and Yellow Seas for more than 250 years. It just completely falls apart due to internal conflict, because the geography has so many mismatching demands. Southern China is basically jungle, tropical, mosquito-filled swampland, and northern China is very, very geographically sequestered from that region. So, and it's very hard for them because of the mountain regions in between them, other than like along the coast there where there is a large Chinese plain. It's very hard for them to have a stable state society. I think that is largely changing to some degree because of technology. Like, if you go look across time, states only get as big as you can usually move across in a couple of weeks, maybe 2 weeks, reasonably. And thanks to trains and airplanes, that's faster. It's a larger distance. But I still don't see China not surviving for another maybe 100 years or so. It's reaching its timetable. History just repeats itself too much for it to stay stable much longer.
So if we look at Japan for a comparison, you've got an island state which is largely homogeneous. That would be why they have historically had a more stable kind of society, kind of thing.
So Japan's a really interesting one, because Japan also doesn't have much arable land on its landmass. And their ability to produce a strong navy has largely been pretty insufficient, because their ocean going ability was limited by weather. And they were also so internally focused on conflict, because just in the next valley, somebody's going to come and steal all my rice if I don't build a castle and defend it. So, and there was it's a really good example of how nobody trusts each other when each population is dropped into its own little mountain valley.
Hmm?
Anybody from an adjacent mountain valley could just steal your stuff, so you don't trust anyone, right? And that's like a really interesting cultural impact of geography. Like, if you live in a mountainous region, you're more likely to be reclusive, you're more likely to have a traditional or a conservative ideology, you're more likely to you know mistrust outsiders. You just have a hard time trusting outsiders because it's hard for you to get supplies, it's hard for you to do agriculture, and somebody from another river valley or excuse me, from another mountain valley could come and take your stuff
Okay.
really easily. So, or if they took it, it'd be hard for you to replace it. That's what I should say. It's not easy, but if they took it, it'd be hard for them to replace it.
Yeah, I see how this works. So basically, it's a kind of a defensive mechanism.
Right. So that's why, like, in early dark age Japan, you saw so many feudal lords constantly warring with each other. It was a total crapshoot. Who got to be the shogun, is constantly in turmoil. Only by like sheer charisma and domination could one ruler hold it together, maybe for 2 generations before the whole thing fell into civil war, or by our perspective, civil war.
Yeah,
It wasn't until a larger force like the Mongol invasion, or some sort of external pressure unified Japan into a larger national entity.
yeah, that's one of the things, because I mean, like, if you think about it, uh, that doesn't work. I mean, like, your lord is attacking the neighbor's lord, the neighbor's lord is attacking his other neighbors, and your friends and your cousins and whatever. It shouldn't be able to survive if you think about it, but they kept doing it.
Yeah. So, and they do it because they realize they like, if you go to Japan, they have one of the best public
Hmm?
transport systems on the planet as well. And there are cities that definitely have better public transit um than Japan for sure. But like, as a nation, as a whole, like, just the fact that you can just get on a train and go basically anywhere really unifies a lot of the culture, and unifies a lot of trade. So in a way, because they're able to trade and exchange cultural ideas because of those trains, it
Hmm?
helps unify and overcome the geographical problems that they're experiencing, if that
So,
makes sense. So,
yeah,
like,
this
that ease of trade overcomes the mountain valley problem.
is it also a case of just meeting people more frequently?
Right.
Rather, I
Exactly.
mean, if you're living on a mountain in the 1600s, maybe you meet one new person every 20 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
As opposed to for example, um if you live on the coast of France, on at the mouth of one of its 3 or 4 rivers, you're constantly going to be trading with Prussians, with Dutch, with Belgians, with Spanish, with Portuguese. All of these people are going to be going up and down your river system. So your livelihood is dependent
Hmm.
on their mercantile practices. So,
So it's a question of actually needing them there, because that's where you're getting your stuff from. Yeah.
right. Well, see, that's what's really interesting is if you live in a mountain, you don't need them. You've taught yourself how to get all the supplies that you need. You might be very poor. A really good example of that is northern Kentucky, West Virginia, uh Western Virginia, northern East Tennessee, all of that the southern Appalachian region uh is, you can just talk to anybody from that region who like lives in a mid-sized city,
Hmm.
and they'll tell you, oh yeah, there's this one particular neighborhood up in the mountains, you don't go there, you just don't do it, right? um like, they'll drop a tree behind your car, they'll throw flaming bottles at you. If they think you're the tax man, you're going to be dead. Like, you just don't do it. Like, so they're very very scared of outsiders. And it's because they've learned to survive without people coming into those regions. But if you also look at those regions, you know, to the city slicker who is surrounded by people all day, they're like, why would they fight somebody for trying to help them out of abject poverty? Well, they don't have a reason to trust you. They figured out how to live in abject poverty in the mountains. They don't want your help. They don't need your help. Their family has been there for generations without your help. So you can only hurt me. Is the mindset that those people have.
Yeah, I think this is pretty similar to the example you gave earlier with the Arabs being like, as long as things stay the same, even if they're bad, it's okay. As soon as the something threatens to make it worse, then that's when the shit hits the fan.
Exactly.
Right.
So for that matter, like take a look at for example, Japan. They've now industrialized. They have an interconnected culture. They're very all of the islands of Japan have a very tied together culture. But what happens if for some reason they suddenly are cut off from oil and fuel supplies? What happens to their culture at that point? They're so reliant on international trade, and that enables their culture to exist in the current way that it does. So you remove something like that, it's going to change things.
No, absolutely. Cross saying that's why the Silk Road was kind of a big deal.
Yeah. So that's talking about the Silk Road is a really interesting thing, right? Because generally speaking, you want to sail. Using waterborne transport is absolutely the cheapest way to move materials. Usually it's something like it's usually 20 times cheaper to do like deep water navigation than it is to use ground-based transport. So if you're going to move some kind of supply across a large expanse of terrain, it's got to be some sort of commodity that is extremely valuable. And that's the only reason the Silk Road was able to exist to start with, because silk was extremely valuable. It was worth the risk. It was worth the expense of moving it across Central Asia, as opposed to sailing, all around the pirates through, it was cheaper to move it across the Himalayan mountains than it was to sail, past pirates in the Strait of Malacca, past pirates off the coast of India, past pirates off the coast of the Seychelles Mountains, and then possibly sail all the way around Africa, or put it on a barge and, send it up the Horn of Africa or something like that. So up into Egypt. So, it's really interesting that, you wouldn't purchase a commodity that's cheap and affordable from a foreign actor if you can get it, if it's so cheap and easy to get. Like, it's everywhere, right? Like, there are very few foodstuffs that America imports, for example, and when we do, we largely import it from Mexico. So, and the only stuff that we do import are extremely high value added things like Wagyu beef, right? Like,
okay.
or New Zealander dairy, like specific cheeses from Europe, and they're all really expensive. If you want milk from a New Zealand dairy farm, you're gonna pay through the nose for it. It's $20 a gallon. So, you're only going to have a long trade route like that when the commodity is extremely value added.
Okay, so we're talking stuff like silks, spices, jewels, maybe something like that.
Exactly, or jewelry, art, collectible art, stuff like that.
All right. So it's even products rather than, it's not just materials.
Right. Generally speaking, so, and this is a really interesting, just like as a aside here, this isn't explicitly about geopolitics, but something that I think a lot of people, especially people who are into collectibles, and even more so now with cryptocurrency, something that I think a lot of people are misunderstanding about the concept of wealth is that wealth is not derived by having some kind of currency. Currency is just what we have agreed as a method of communication to exchange wealth, right? So, what is wealth? Well, I have a piece of land that has a bunch of trees on it. Okay, that makes me wealthy with trees, but it's not, being wealthy with trees is not necessarily a large valuable thing.
Okay.
So you have to process the trees. You're going to cut them down and cut them into timber, right? Now you have fallen trees that have no limbs on them. That's more usable. You can build log cabins with that, right? Or you can take it to a lumber mill and turn it into lumber. Now you can build, rough furniture with it. Or you can cut it into plywood or turn it into paper. And, the more further up the value chain you get,
Mhm.
that tree can be turned into a musical instrument. For example, you might be able to turn a tree into a guitar, but and the guitar has a lot of wealth in it, right? The person all of the people along the way who turned the tree into lumber or into timber and then to lumber and then into somebody had to learn how to do woodworking and all of the tools needed in order to make the guitar. It has a certain wealth to it. So when you apply that at scale, certain cities, certain communities are going to exchange all of their culture and ideas. Population group will get really good at a thing. They will get really good at turning a raw resource into some kind of product or service, right?
Okay.
So, and you can see this like with Silicon Valley, for example. There's so much tech entrepreneurialism in Silicon Valley that it gets its name Silicon Valley. So that's where the wealth is. That's what happens. So you don't want to disrupt that. Money is just how we move that wealth around in a communication method. It's the language of wealth, if you will. So to that end, to kind of loop that back into geopolitics, you can't just say, Russia's economy after the fall of the Soviet Union is a really good example of this. You can't just say, okay, well, there's oil here, so now I'm rich. Now I get money. It doesn't work like that. Or for that matter, this is why I particularly take issue with people who overinvest in cryptocurrency. It's all speculative. So when Russia tried to restart their economy, Yeltsin realized that the easiest thing to do was to pivot to a commodity based economy because it's the easiest thing to do. You turn on the coal plants, you start up the coal mines, you start mining lumber, you start doing agriculture. Okay, we've got all the basics. We've got food, we've got lumber, we've got building materials, we've got coal, we've got, but they couldn't get oil. Oil's really hard to do. It's a lot of process to get oil. So they had to hire external companies like Halliburton to come in and process their oil and natural gas. So you have to have a population that is trained and has the knowledge in order to do it. And that's something that Russia just didn't have after the fall of the Soviet Union. And that's where wealth is. And that's where wealth really is derived from, which is why you never really wanted to bomb a city during the age of gunpowder.
Okay.
Capturing a city was the prize. That's where the wealth was. That's where people knew how to do the things. And you can have a bunch of tools. You can have all the infrastructure, but if you don't have the people to operate it,
Of
then
course.
you don't actually have anything.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yep. So anyway, I kind of got rambly there.
No, it's definitely very interesting. Again, that would be something else to explore on a longer discussion.
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, I'm good to keep going for a little while.
Okay, I have no problem with that. I'm not going to complain about that.
Okay.
So, going back to history repeat itself for a second again.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
How much does past history affect the cycle? In the sense, Okay, so let's say that, yeah, I remember when my great grandfather invaded that country and now they don't like us. Or
Right.
is it more economic? Is it a case of more like, okay, some people keep fighting over the same thing because the same conditions are there, but also they remember when they were attacked or they heard stories about when they were attacked or stuff like that?
Right. So, really good example of this again is in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
Um, you know, the nations of Eastern Europe have been fighting each other, gosh, since they were nations. You know, since Rome started bumping up against them, and they've always had an issue of communicating with each other, and largely that's got to be, you know, the countries around, you know, north of Greece all the way up to Belarus, like that region is just so mountainous and, you know, so filled with different ethnicities of people that it's hard to develop trade relationships across terrain like that, right? So history will constantly repeat itself because not there's definitely a cultural aspect there, sure, but it repeats itself because the geography prevents those people from having any kind of meaningful relationship with each other that would prevent it. So this is why it's a really big deal. I feel like one of the best things that has come about since the fall of the Soviet Union, as far as geopolitical security, is the Three Seas Initiative. If you're familiar with that,
No idea. So.
it is a road and highway project to build a bunch of highway systems, like paved infrastructure, that will connect the Caspian, Aegean, and Baltic seas together. So all the way from, you know, even Sweden is partly going to benefit from this, Sweden and Finland, but you know, all the way from Estonia down to Greece, all of these countries don't currently have good infrastructure for doing any kind of transport between them. They have to, you know, all of the highways that exist in those regions all point to Moscow. They all go to Moscow. And that's because the Soviet
All
Union,
right.
you know, dictated what was going on infrastructure wise there. So, um, if you can build interstate infrastructure, if you can build internet infrastructure, if you can build, you know, gas pipelines, natural gas pipelines, I think there's two of them planned for the project that move all those supplies between those countries, then they all develop a trade interdependence on one another. And you know, that's one of the bedrock things that has to be done in order to keep people from, you have to have a reason to get over your, you know, the wars of your grandfather, for example. You have to have a reason to get over that, otherwise you don't have a reason to not trust those people. So and you can see a similar thing happen with France and Germany, right? Like
Yeah.
we had the Treaty of Westphalia, which created the longest period of peace in Western Europe up until the NATO alliance was formed. And it was because they said, okay, we're going to have a treaty, but we're also going to have economic relations between France and Germany. And once those economic relationships started to break down, that's when, you know, military conflict resumed in between France and Germany.
Hmm.
So, and now you can see the NATO response of Russia's invasion into the Ukraine. You know, there was a huge suite of sanctions. Like we don't need to discuss the absolute massive amounts of sanctions that were dropped on Russia by all of the European nations. But one of the countries that dropped the least was Germany. And that's because they were so reliant on trade for coal and for natural gas from Russia that they didn't want to disrupt that that relationship. So for better or for worse, you know, and obviously it's for worse in this instance, you know, Germany got caught with their hands in their pockets. Like, what do? We need to do something, but we can't get off of natural gas. So they knew that the economic cost would be too high. But what you ended up seeing, really interesting, and this is going to cause even more peace relationships between Germany and France, is within a matter of like 3 weeks, something like that, the electric grids of France and Germany, all kinds of new infrastructure was developed to just move nuclear power from France over to Germany, so that Germany did not have to be so reliant on Russian
Right.
natural gas imports in order to uh, so that they could start weaning themselves off of natural gas from Russia and join in the cadre of sanctions in order to try and economically strangle out the war that's going on in Ukraine. So it works as a double-edged sword. I'm not saying that like it's necessarily an inherently good thing, but having those economic ties stops military activity.
Yeah, it's like as a species we need to be bribed not to beat each other up. So, I understand you're also working on a book at the moment. Would you like to tell us about
Yes.
that?
Uh, it's very slow going. Most of my free time is devoted to writing scripts for my YouTube channel. Um, but I've currently got it outlined and a little bit of like the first chapter about terrain. I'm not exactly settled on a title for it yet. But the title is, but the concept is just fantasy world building through the lens of geopolitics. So, a lot of people fall into this false dichotomy of, do you want to build outward in, like I'm going to start with a massive map and then
Mm-hmm.
slowly zoom in on a place after I get external things identified, or building a city or building a small region and then going outward from there to flesh out the world. And um those are fine ways to go, to develop the world, sure, but I feel like doing so locks people into like I said, it's a very false dichotomy understanding of world building. And something that is not discussed enough is uh and you'll see like hard science fiction writers
Mm-hmm.
really complain about this the most. A lot of people just don't know how to create a cohesive world that is geopolitically consistent, or at least come up with an understanding of why uh the world that you're in would not be geopolitically consistent. So understanding, like, if there is a mountain region here and it is inhabited by dwarves, what specifically does that mean from like a demography perspective, from an economic perspective? What is actually happening there? um you know as opposed to just saying there's dwarves and they do these things. Understanding how that population would interact with other populations based on their geography is something that's largely missing. And I hope this book serves as like both an ivory tower kind of a academia style understanding of how to look at any world through that lens of of geopolitics, but then also stepping back, and one thing I want to do is provide like a walkthrough or a toolkit to say, okay, you have a world. Now let's look at it through this lens together. And we're going to slowly pick apart, like, based on the geography, where would sites of conflict constantly arise? Where would sites of security constantly arise? And, what would happen as far as your world building? Like what would how do I want to say this? What would the ramifications of the world be if suddenly something was disrupted? So for example, if you had a world where everybody was, fat, dumb, and happy, and you had basically utopia. There was no conflict, but it all required all of the trade in order to work just so, right? Like international trade had to be done just perfectly. And then all of a sudden, a demon army shows up. Why specifically? What would be the ramifications of that demon army showing up? How could you show the ramifications economically or socially on the other side of the planet just because that happened.
You could have something like, I don't know, a series of accidents in iron mines, and then suddenly that whole trade network, which is based on that, going.
Exactly. And it's not just so what's interesting is that even though there's this new demon army and it is, causing havoc on this one continent on the other side of the planet, because that other side of the planet was so dependent, like as you said, on exporting oil, on exporting iron or iron tools to regions of the planet that don't have good iron sources. Now all of a sudden they're starved for iron tools. So now they have like their own political uprising, and it just kicks everything into chaos.
Yeah.
And they may not even be aware that there's this, demon army attacking a mining kingdom on the other side of the planet. So, I see the dungeon matron in the comments there talking about Frank Herbert's Dune, and yeah, that's a great example of what happens when you have one resource that is that the entire population is entirely reliant on to survive.
Yeah, thinking about it, it also makes for great foreshadowing. You can just start, this is the main plot, but first we're going to start it small with, like, I don't know, a shortage of hammers, whatever.
Right.
Okay, and yeah, or you could also do it the other way, and I don't know, make up a fantasy language and then make a mythology based on that, and then make a map and then make a story and so on.
Right.
Which is the proper way of doing it.
No. I think what's interesting is it's something that I'll probably do in a toolkit. Is, and you really don't even need that much. The understanding the geopolitics of your fantasy world, or like, I guess I should say, understanding what the status quo of your geopolitics would be. Like, for example, status quo is Argentina, France. Those countries are going to be very secure, right? Status quo geopolitically, Eastern Europe is constantly going to be in, some sort of physical conflict. China, southern China especially, is going to be constantly in physical conflict. So if that's the status quo, then pick a timetable and kind of like work forward. And you don't need that much, just 200 years. Work forward. What happens? Okay, so somebody overcomes the status quo in this conflict area, and now you have some sort of warlord that takes over until he dies, or maybe he has a charismatic son, and or something like that, and that warlord and the next 3 generations are able to hold things together because they just happen to be charismatic. But then it all comes unglued again because their ability to hammer everybody into compliance no longer is present. So understanding that can help flesh out a little bit of like the world cultures, a little bit of your understanding of the world, and help you relate to your players when you're playing the game, like why things are a certain way they are, having that frame of reference in order to understand your own world, if that makes sense.
It does make a lot of sense, and again, it's more. I think it's more engaging than the simple, yeah, because they're evil, or whatever it is.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So I am definitely looking forward to your book whenever it comes out, and I hope you'll.
It'll
be back
probably
to...
be a couple of years.
No rush. There's no rush, but I do hope you'll be back here to talk about it once it's finished.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I'd be more than happy to come back.
Okay, just in case anyone wants to look into more updates, here's the Baron's newsletter. I suggest you subscribe, and if you are not subscribed to his channel, definitely look him up on YouTube. I'm pasting the link in the chat right now.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, thank you. So, I think we just crossed over the hour, and I don't want to take too much of your time.
Okay.
But thank you again for coming here. This was a really good conversation, and thank you so much again.
Yeah, thanks for letting me ramble. I appreciate it.
Oh, it was a pleasure listening to you. Always a pleasure.
All right.
So
take care, Karl.
You too, thanks, and have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And goodbye, everyone.